Hey there! This video is going to be a deep dive technical review of the Nikon ZF for shooting video. Now I know the ZF is really regarded as a retro style photography centric camera, but I'm going to talk about it for video because it is a pretty powerful little video camera as well. Now before we dive into it, just have to have a huge thank you to B&H Photo who lent me the Nikon ZF to test review and make videos like this for all of you. B&H has been so supportive of the channel, so if you're looking to pick up some gear, go check out what they have. There are links in the description below for the Nikon ZF and all the gear that I use on a regular basis. So let's start off with some of the specs with this Nikon ZF. This is a pretty cool looking camera in my opinion. So we'll start with the sensor. The sensor is a 24.5 megapixel full frame backside illuminated sensor. So backside illuminated sensors are generally better for low light. Now this will give us roughly a 6K resolution, but you can't record in 6K on this camera. It does oversample that to 4K in some of the modes. So let's talk about some of the codecs. Now, there's really only one good codec in this camera for shooting 4K video, and that's the 4K H.265 10-bit. This is actually a 420 codec. And I know a lot of people were assuming it's 422, but if you look in the manual, it's 420. It's the same thing that's in the Nikon Z8, and this is actually a long op compression. So this will give us a lot of flexibility and a good amount of information. I do want to also point out that it only shoots in UHD or 16:9. There is no DCI or 17:9. There's also no open gate recording in video. Not really expected in this photocentric camera, but I just want to point that out. In terms of frame rates, it's pretty simple. If you're going to shoot in the full frame 4K modes, that's known as FX, and you can shoot in 24, 25, or 30 frames per second, and that will oversample the 6K or the full width of the sensor down to 4K. Now, if you are shooting in anything above that, so 4K 50 or 60 frames per second, it does crop in on the sensor by about 1.5 times. That's known as their DX crop in the Nikon world. And in terms of the bit rates, for the FX 24, 25, and 30, you get 190 megabits per second, and the DX 50 and 60 frames per second, you get 340 megabits per second. And of course, like I said, that's a long op compression. So I do want to mention that I've made a bunch of videos about the Nikon ZF already, and I'll leave those all linked down below if you want a deeper dive into some of these topics. But first of all, let's talk about image quality. Now, I did a first impressions video where I went out and captured a whole bunch of footage from Durham, North Carolina, and I was really happy with the overall image quality coming out of the ZF. I really like the colors, the dynamic range was good, the sharpness, just the overall image was very pleasant and very nice, and I was really happy with it. So if you want to check out that first impressions video, like I said, that link, it will be linked down below. So I do want to take a quick look and see how the 4K 24 stacks up against the 4K 60. Now remember, the 4K 24 is oversampled from the full frame or full width 6K, and the 4K 60 is not oversampled, and it crops in 1.5 times. So taking a look here at the color charts, I don't see much of a difference here in terms of colors, and overall image looks very similar between them. Now zooming in, hopefully you can see a little bit of a difference here. The full frame 4K 24 looks a little bit sharper and has a little bit less noise, but overall the 4K 60 does pretty well. So the Nikon ZF allows you to shoot in N-Log, which is absolutely fantastic because this being a very photocentric camera, having N-Log is absolutely huge because it gives us a lot more dynamic range and allows us a lot more flexibility in post. I find that the grading is very easy on this, but I do want to mention that N-Log is actually in the Rec 2020 color space, so make sure you use some sort of conversion to get into 709 before you grade it. And just playing with the footage and grading it was super easy, and I really enjoyed the colors. So straight out of camera, it does have quite a bit of contrast and saturation. Just applying a Rec 709 N-Log conversion, and this is a very simple grade. Like I said, it is very easy to grade the footage out of the Nikon ZF in N-Log. If you're curious about how to expose N-Log properly, I did make a video about that too, and I'll leave that video linked down below. In terms of dynamic range, I found that the ZF does have quite a bit in N-Log, like you can see in this shot here. And in my deep dive dynamic range test video, I did compare it with a few other cameras like the Canon R5C, Red Komodo, and Blackmagic 6K full frame. And like I said, if you want to check that out, link down below. And comparing it here with the R5C, I found that overall they had pretty similar dynamic range when you're shooting the R5C in C-Log 3, which is actually pretty surprising for, you know, a camera like the ZF to be able to compete with the R5C. And then when I did the over and under exposure tests, I found that in the highlights, the R5C just did maybe a little bit better, but the Nikon ZF did a little bit better in the shadows, in the underexposure test. So like I said, very similar dynamic range to the R5C, which is pretty cool. It's a camera that you can do a lot with when you're shooting in N-Log. In terms of low light, the ZF actually performs better than I expected. Of course, it does have that backside illuminated sensor, which helps with low light or high ISO performance. Here it is at 12,800, and my studio lit only by a candle. And I did, in my low light comparison video, compare it with the R5C, and actually the ZF performed really, really well. And it was, as I said, I think it did a little bit better than I expected. Now, it is not like a low light beast in any way, but one thing I want to mention is that there's actually a dual base ISO for the ZF when you're shooting in analog of 800 and 6400. And I don't think a lot of people know about this, but I've been in touch with one of the engineers at Nikon, and been asking him a bunch of questions to get more information to share with all of you. So one thing you want to notice here is, you know, in the middle ISO range, when you go from 5000 to 6400, it cleans up quite a bit there, and you can definitely see that that's going on. So it definitely helps with that middle to middle high ISO range. But you could definitely use this in some of the higher ISOs and get a pretty good image. So overall, the low light performance does pretty well, and, you know, like hangs in there against cameras like the R5C. Next, we'll talk about rolling shutter, and it does not do well in the rolling shutter department here. It definitely has a pretty slow readout on the 4K 24 mode. That, again, that is oversampled from 6K. So testing that out in the full frame mode, I got 22.2 milliseconds for the readout speed, and in the 4K 60 crop mode, I got 14.7 milliseconds. So as expected, it does a little bit better in the 4K 60 mode because that is not an oversample, but this camera does not do very well for rolling shutter, and you'll definitely know this with fast-moving subjects, or if you're trying to hand-hold the camera, you might get a little bit of that jello-y, jiggly kind of look. So just want to point that out in terms of rolling shutter. Next, I want to talk about overheating, battery life, and run times. And I think this is one of the places where there's going to be a little bit of a limitation if you're using this as a heavy video camera. And it's good to know the limitations and what to expect so you're not caught off guard when you're relying on a camera. So I do want to mention here that when you are using the ZF and how I did the testing here, make sure that you come over to the setup option here and change the auto temperature cutoff to high. There is a standard mode, but make sure you set it to high. It will let the camera run a little bit warmer and run a little bit longer. This is becoming a pretty standard setting in a lot of mirrorless cameras, so make sure you do that. And for all these tests, of course, I had it on high. Also, I had the screen open, and I did have it on a tripod to get maximum airflow. If you have the screen closed with mirrorless cameras, it often keeps more heat in there and it overheats faster. So for these tests, what I did was I tested here in the studio, which is around 75 degrees Fahrenheit. I also tested outside in the direct sun. Of course, the clouds are in and out a little bit. It was around 80 degrees Fahrenheit that day, but it was getting sunlight on it to heat up the camera a lot faster. All right, first test here in the studio is the 4K 24. Basically, the camera ran until the battery died. The overheat warning did come on. Basically, the camera ran out of memory and I had to reformat the card, and it ran for another minute and a half. So a total of 2 hours and 6 minutes in terms of runtime, and the camera did not overheat, but the warning light did come on. Next is 4K 60, and the camera overheated in 52 minutes. It is pretty cool after it goes through all of its warnings. It actually gives you a second countdown until it overheats, so I think that's pretty neat. It gives you a really good estimation and lets you know what's going on. So 52 minutes at 4K 60 indoors. 4K 24 outside, the camera ran for 1 hour and 5 minutes when it decided to overheat. Like I said, it was around 80 degrees Fahrenheit and it was sitting out in the sun. So definitely reduced time outside. And I feel like if it was hotter than 80, it would overheat even faster. And lastly, 4K 60 is going to overheat even faster, as you'd expect. It actually only lasted 23 minutes before the camera overheated. So of course, this camera is going to be a little bit limiting in terms of run times. Your mileage may vary. I didn't actually test this using USB-C power or having an HDMI out because that can sometimes alter the run times. But for 4K 24 in the studio, it did run until the battery died, so that's nice. And of course, limited run times in 4K 60 as you'd expect and outside. But I just want to report the numbers so you have them. Next, let's talk about autofocus, and I didn't get a chance to test this in depth, but I will share some stuff about it. Now, in terms of the subject detection options, there are quite a few in here, which is cool. There is the auto mode, which I absolutely love when cameras have an auto mode, but people, animal, vehicle, and airplanes. For the testing that I did, I shot it with the people mode turned on because I was shooting myself. All the stuff that I shot in that first impressions video was actually using manual focus. I just personally been using manual focus a lot more than autofocus just across the board. It's kind of something that's been happening to me lately. So let's take a look at some basic tests here I did just shooting outside. The first example here is one that I shot with the Nikon 24-120 f4 lens, and I shot this at f4, and this was at 120 millimeters to try to force it a little bit to see how well it does. You know, this was, in my opinion, it performed pretty well. So you can see here on the left the actual image, and on the right you can see how it's tracking me. And I think it does a pretty good job about tracking the face and the eye. Really no complaints here about how it was working in this situation. This was with all of the default settings. You know, I saw pretty good performance. This next one I shot at 50 millimeters, and for this one I wanted to use more of a backlit situation to see how it would handle it. And like before, you know, it did pretty well. Of course, these were properly exposed and the sensor was getting enough light, but you know, I think for basic autofocus stuff, I think it worked pretty well. I didn't get to test this out for animals and all the other subject detection modes, which I would have loved to do, but it has decent autofocus for sure. Next, we'll talk about stabilization, and there are a few different options included in the ZF. So Nikon's vibration reduction, or VR, is what most of us know as our IBIS, or sensor shift stabilization. So you do have that in here. It does have IBIS, and there's also an electronic VR or stabilization. So in the camera here, under vibration reduction, there are a couple different options. There's on normal, which is what I tested, and there's sport, which is for like panning sport. So if you're doing a lot of panning motions, that's what that settings there is for, but I had it on normal. And there's also the electronic VR, which will crop in a little bit to give you a little bit more stable shot. Like most cameras, they do have IBIS and electronic stab. So let's take a look at some examples here to see how they do. So for all these tests, I use the Nikon 24-120 f4. Here's a sort of vlogging test at 24 millimeters, and this is taking a look first at no stabilization to give you a baseline. Now this is with the vibration reduction turned on. So this is IBIS on, electronic stab off. This is IBIS on and electronic stabilization turned on. I think it does pretty well, and I am literally just walking and holding the camera, not trying to make it stable at all. And just out of curiosity, I wanted to see what the IBIS looked like off with the electronic stabilization turned on. The other shot I like to look at is a stable shot. This is around 50 millimeters, and this is with no stabilization. This is with the IBIS turned on, the VR turned on, and the electronic stab turned off. And this is with both the IBIS and the electronic stabilization turned on. Overall, I thought the IBIS and electronic stab worked pretty well in this camera. This isn't, you know, the best option out there for mirrorless cameras, but for general purpose use of hand holding a camera, I think it did pretty well. When I did my first impressions video and when I do any sort of street videography stuff, I always hold the camera up to my eye to give me a third point of contact. So that definitely also helps with the stabilization, but the fact that this includes IBIS is awesome. All right, next let's talk about the build quality, the design, and the ergonomics of this camera. And I think that's a huge discussion point for this camera because it looks really cool, and in my opinion, it's really fun to use. So it has this sort of retro style design. It looks like it's sort of analog SLR camera from back in the day. And yes, I am old enough to have shot on those cameras when they were the only options. So that's the first thing let's talk about are these dials on the top. You have a dial on all the way on the left for switching between manual and aperture shutter and, you know, program modes. So that's there. You have an ISO control here, which I absolutely love to have a physical dial for ISO. I can look down and know that it's set at 800. This is the shutter adjustment. You also have the on-off switch, which is great, and it turns on and off very quickly. You have a record button and a shutter, and this is the exposure compensation. The other thing it's got going on here is there's a little aperture window here. So this is saying, you know, the lens is at f4. So that's pretty cool. And then over here underneath this, we have the switch between to go from photo to video to black and white, although the black and white, I believe, is just for photos. So onto the back of the camera, very simple layout. I do wish we had a third dial here for exposure, but we do not, but it's okay because we have all the dials on the top. In terms of the EVF is a 0.5 inch 3.69 million dot, and the flip out screen here is a 3.2 inch 2.1 million dot. Of course, it's a fully articulating screen for filming yourself and different angles and all that kind of stuff. I thought that the EVF and LCD both were fantastic. I could see them very clearly outside. I really had no complaints about them, especially on this size of a camera and for the price point, so really no complaints about that. One thing I do want to point out here are the fact that they put these flappy triangle things. You probably have been hearing these things flap around this whole time during this video. I absolutely hate these. I wish camera companies would stop doing this design and just put the little like space in here to put the strap through. So I usually take these off unless I absolutely need a strap. So let's talk about the ports on the side here. We do have just enough. For this kind of camera, we have USB-C, which you can run power delivery on, which is fantastic. We have a headphone jack. We have a 3.5 mil mic jack, and we also have micro HDMI micro HDMI. Of course, I'd love full-size HDMI, but this camera is, rather small, and it's kind of what you'd expect here. One thing about the ergonomics here is that this has this little bump here for the grip. It is a little bit hard to use, and I felt myself sort of like clawing it and sort of pinching really hard to hold it in my hand. And I know there are some accessories to get bigger grips on here. So I think that would definitely be something you'd want to consider if you're doing this, using this camera quite a bit. Now onto the bottom, I do want to talk about the battery and the memory cards for a second. And first of all, they did put a really good sized battery in here. This is like their full size battery. And like I already reported on the runtimes, great battery life. It was really cool. Now this camera has dual slots, but it's a little bit weird. It has an SD card slot, and I generally use these pro grade cards, and they work really well on this camera. Now there is a micro SD card slot, and I have to say that you do, in my opinion, have to take the battery out to get this out. So if I have this in here, I really just cannot get my hands in here to get that out. So I take the battery out, and then you can take the micro SD card out of there. So in my opinion, the micro SD card it's nice as a backup, but I do want to show you that in the camera, it is a little bit limiting for shooting video. So overall, I think the build quality is really great on this camera, and I really like the design and the ergos. It's just really fun to use this camera. That's the only way I can really describe it. It's just very different for me, and I will talk about that a little bit later on in the video. I do also want to mention that the camera is a little bit heavier than you might imagine it to be. I think that was my first impression when I picked up the camera, is it felt a little bit heavier, and that can actually be a good thing in my opinion, because a lot of times when you have a heavier camera, it just makes you feel like you have a more high quality camera. Also, when you're shooting video, weight helps to get rid of micro jitters. Of course, this is still a fairly light camera in the grand scheme of things, and you're going to be relying on stabilization, and most people are probably not going to be rigging this out for heavy video use. But overall, I really had a lot of fun shooting with this camera, and I think that's a big selling feature is part of that. And what you can see on here is the 40mm f2, and that is one of the kit lenses. And I think they did a really good job designing this to make this match the camera really well. In terms of video assist tools in the camera, we do have something I didn't expect, and that is the fact that we have a waveform. So it defaults to histogram, which is what most of us expect in mirrorless cameras, but we have the waveform option, and we also have the large waveform option, which is great for a lot of detail, but it pretty much blocks the entire screen. So I'd recommend you either using waveform or histogram. And the other tool it has is the fact that it has zebras, like most cameras do. So you do have two different options here for mid and high. So those are the two video assist tools in the camera. There isn't any false color, and there's no shutter angle, but it's totally expected in this camera. This is not a cinema camera, but the fact that it has waveform is pretty cool. So next, let's talk about some of the quirks of this camera for shooting video. And some of these, there are workarounds in the camera. Some of you just have to learn how to use them. So I just want to bring this to your attention. First of all, when you flip the screen forward, it gets rid of a lot of information, which was really surprising to me when I was filming myself. So if you're doing that, make sure you realize this limitation. I'll show you how to fix this. But when we flip the screen forward here, you can see that the information disappears as soon as it flips forward. And it's really hard when you're filming yourself. You want to get things like exposure and all the other information that you need for when you're filming. So the way that you turn this off is if you go in the menu under the setup page here. This is the self-portrait mode, so turn that off and then it'll work okay. The next thing I want to mention is the lens mount. And if you've never used a Nikon camera like myself until somewhat recently, testing the Z8 and then the ZF, is that the lens mount is actually backwards. So you have to twist it this way to get the lens off. So just want to keep that in mind if you're trying to get it off. Also the caps, everything is just backwards from the other manufacturers if you're used to other manufacturers. If you're only used to Nikon, then it's the normal way. Also the focus is backwards from the other sort of manufacturers, but you can change this setting in the menu if you're using autofocus lenses. Of course, if you're using Nikon manual focus lenses, well, those go the opposite way as well. The next thing I want to point out here is the shutter. And so the fact that you have these dials is really cool, but the problem for video is that, I need, for example, 1/48 or 1/50 for shooting 24 frames per second, and there is no option for 50 here. So what I have to do is set this to 1/3 step and then control it in the camera. So you just want to keep that in mind when you're shooting in manual mode and controlling everything. The next thing is the view assist, and the view assist is basically a display LUT in the camera that will help you while you're shooting an N-Log. I highly recommend that you don't use this, and I went over this in a recent video about how to expose N-Log. Basically, it blows out the image, and I'd really recommend just leaving it off. So just keep that in mind. Just leave the view assist off, and you're gonna have to view it in log on the camera. The next thing I want to mention is the dual recording capabilities of this camera. Now, like I said earlier, this camera does have two card slots, but it's a little bit limiting, or actually very limiting in video. So if you go in the video menu here, the only real option you have is to choose the destination between the SD and the micro SD. There is no backup dual recording. There is no relay recording, any of that stuff. In photo mode, there are a couple options in terms of how you want to handle your secondary slot function. But for video, it's pretty limiting. So basically the second card slot, I just think of it as like a backup card that you can always leave in there and then just don't worry about it because they're fairly cheap and that sort of thing. But in terms of dual recording and those functions in video, that's not in this camera. So I think the biggest thing for me about wanting to test out the ZF and my experience with it so far is it's actually a really fun camera to use, like I was saying before. And for someone like myself who is a videographer and a YouTuber, a lot of the cameras that I use, I shoot on high-end mirrorless cameras and cinema cameras and stuff like that. They feel like work. This camera does not feel like work to me. And when I took it out to shoot with it, it was so much fun. I was also hoping it might inspire me to do some photography, which wasn't the case. I'm pretty much just a video guy. But just the fact that it's just different, when I pick this up, it doesn't feel like a work camera to me. It just feels fun. And that goes a long way when you're doing this stuff for a living, is having a camera that's a little bit different. So is this camera good for video? I have to say that it actually is better than I thought it would be, based on the fact that it is really a retro style photography camera. But this isn't a camera that I would buy for video. So that leads me to the big question of who this camera's for. Now, I think a lot of people will buy this camera for doing photography, street photo, family stuff, events, just having a fun camera, maybe as their main camera, maybe as a secondary camera for different sort of shooting, different sort of experience. I like the tactile features of the camera. But I think this can be really good as like a B camera or maybe a C camera. So if you already have like a Nikon Z8 or Z9 or something like that you're using as your workhorse video camera and you want a fun secondary camera, you could definitely use this for a B or a C camera, and you have a lot of dynamic range. Like I showed you, it's decent in low light and stuff like that, but it's a little bit limiting in terms of run times with overheating. This isn't like a workhorse video camera, but if you have this, and let's say you're a photographer, and you just want to shoot a little bit of video on the side, maybe for social media, maybe you just need a few clips, maybe your client wants a few other things, or maybe you just want to record stuff for your family. This camera is very capable for video, so I think that's really cool. Now, in terms of the price, this camera is currently selling for $2,000 or just over $2,200 with this 40mm f2 kit lens. I think it's a really cool camera. I had a lot of fun using it, and I just wanted to share some of my experiences and some of my tests about the video capabilities of this camera. If you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe down below. It'd be greatly appreciated. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.